Okay, so I'm just going to provide a brief overview of today's business. The committee will receive a briefing from the Assembly's Research and Information Service, providing an overview of issues that arose during the consideration of the Reservoirs Bill and an update on progress since the enactment of the 2015 Act. We're going to receive oral evidence from the Department for Infrastructure, providing an update on the transport strategy. We're going to receive oral evidence from the Driver and Vehicle Agency, providing a business update. We're also going to receive oral evidence in closed session from the Driver and Vehicle Agency on the termination of the vehicle testing contract, and we're going to consider 1 statutory rule and 5 proposals for statutory rules not subject to Assembly procedure. So obviously members, and for those in the public gallery, just remind to keep mobile devices muted, laptops as well muted, and we'll proceed through the agenda as follows. So apologies. I have an apology from John and Peter. Might or may not be able to make it, just depending on things. So we'll see how it goes. And then online we have Mark and Nicola, and I think Keith is just running a wee bit behind time, so he will join us as well. So declarations of interest are remind members that they are obliged to declare any relevant financial or other interests which might reasonably be thought by others to influence their approach to the matter under consideration. Any members who have interest to declare in relation to today's business should do so now or when the particular matter arises in the meeting. So does any members have any interest that they wish to declare? No? Okay. Moving on, I have no chairperson's business today. Item 4 is draft minutes. At page 7 you'll see the draft minutes of proceeding of the meeting on the 30th of April 2025. So I'm just seeking agreement that members are content that the minutes are true and accurate reflection of the meeting on the 30th of April 2025. If so, I'll sign the minutes. Content?
Content.
Okay, thank you. Item 5 is matters arising. So does any members have any matters arising at this moment in time? No? Okay. Item 6, correspondence. At page 19 you'll see the correspondence memo. At page 26 you'll see response to the committee's request for information on the department's role in delivering towards the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, and what funding has been bid for or earmarked to support its delivery for 2025-26 financial year. So I'm just seeking agreement that we forward the response to the committee for the Executive Office for information, and to highlight that the committee is supportive of any initiatives to achieve the goals and aims, obviously, of the strategy. Obviously with public transport, it's really important that safety of women is paramount as well. So are you content with that approach?
Right.
Okay, thank you. Page 28 is a departmental correspondence providing an update on the Eastern Transport Plan. So I'm just seeking agreement that we do schedule a briefing in the Forward Work Programme at a suitable date in relation to that. Agreed?
Yep.
At page 78 you'll see correspondence from the Committee for Finance, enclosing a response from the Minister of Finance on Northern Ireland Water's financial position. Obviously it's interesting given the financial audit that's taken place and the scrutiny work that's going on into Northern Ireland Water's position. So I'm just seeking agreement or members' views that we write to the Committee for Finance to highlight the committee's ongoing scrutiny of Northern Ireland Water against the funding received compared to the funding assessed as being required under the determination by the utility regulator for PTC 21. It's obviously something that we have been quite engaged in this committee, looking at the funding model. So I just think it's important that we do put on record that we have been doing that as a committee as well, if you're in agreement with that. And then members, also just to advise you that you will see in the terms of reference of the financial audit that's taken place, there are dates there with that. It's obviously important that as a committee we have sight of whatever has come out of that audit. So I'm just letting you know that we do have an oral evidence on the findings of the forensic accountant investigation, which is scheduled for the 11th of June. So we will have officials coming up to the committee to brief us then. Okay, happy enough? Yep. Okay, we'll now move on to item 7, which is the Research and Information Service briefing, the Reservoirs Act, Northern Ireland 2015. This is an overview on progress to date. We have oral evidence this morning from Mark Allen. You're very welcome to the committee today. At page 84, you'll see the research paper, the Reservoirs Act, Northern Ireland 2015, which is an overview and progress to date. And at page 118, you'll see the Reservoirs Act, Northern Ireland 2015 timeline. So I'm just seeking agreement, members, that the evidence session is recorded by Hansard, if you're all agreed. Agreed. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mark, for coming to the committee. Can I just say from the outset, I found this research paper really, really useful, and I want to thank you for the amount of work that you put into it and going back through a decade's worth of how this bill came to be. So I found it really, really helpful for my understanding. So I just want to put that on record on, I'm guessing, the behalf of the committee as well, because it is very useful, and it is it'll be useful going forward for the rest of our deliberations on it. So, Mark, without further ado, if you don't mind, 5 minutes just to take us through it, and then if we have any questions, I'll come to members. Thank you. Thank you,
Chair, and thank you, members. And like you've already alluded to, where the pack or the paper is in the pack, so I'm not going to go over that. I suppose the broad aim, as you said, Chair, was to provide an overview of where the Reservoirs Bill or Act really has come since really 2007. So it's 18 years. I have to say it was a bit of a challenge trying to put this into a paper, but hopefully it was something that was accessible, and thank you for your comments on that. I'm happy to take questions. I suppose in some of the instances it's maybe DFI Rivers or the department are better placed to answer, but I'll do my best where I can. So I suppose just on the figure in front of the screen there, page 118 in your pack as well, where this all really begins is the EU Floods Directive in 2007, when the potential flood risk from reservoirs becomes an area of concern. And I suppose the department at the time, which was Agriculture and Rural Development, responded to the actual situation there. And there was effectively a recognition, there was a rationale for a piece of legislation was the fact that reservoir safety was only being covered within Northern Ireland by common law considerations, which are really driven from the Rylands versus Fletcher case from 1868. So there was no dedicated or specific legislation that dealt with reservoir safety or reservoir regulation. Rivers Agency, as I said, then brought forward a reservoirs bill. I should say there was quite a bit of consultation and engagement, including the creation of a stakeholder forum or stakeholder group in 2011, but that led ultimately to the introduction of the bill in 2014. And issues dealt with, I mean, I'm not going to rehearse, you're well aware of at that time the size of what constituted a reservoir, with the proposal being for 10,000 cubic metres of water, the creation of a reservoir manager role with associated responsibilities, the creation of a reservoirs register, the introduction of a risk categorisation designation for reservoirs that was in a low, medium and high risk, requirements for regular inspections by engineers, particularly for medium and high risk designation reservoirs, and potential powers for the department to bring forward a grant scheme. The bill was subject to extensive scrutiny and amendment by the Agriculture and Rural Development Committee, and I suppose the reason I'm here today was I was actually part of that process. You've maybe been here maybe too long when you can remember that length, but I don't think there was anyone around the table at that time was there, but that was quite an extensive piece of work that the committee did. And indeed made significant number of amendments. I think there was a figure was touted at the time was about 200. So there was significant work that was done. Areas of concern that the committee identified included primarily the lack of information on the physical condition of the reservoirs they're being asked to legislate on, and the associated costs. High risk designations would be used, particularly the concept of high risk and medium risk had some concern for members. There was also concern around the role of engineers, and indeed some witnesses outlined the fact that maybe there was a risk that this bill at the time was maybe over-engineering or effectively adding a level of engineering involvement that maybe wasn't required. That was a question. There were also concerns around environmental impacts from changes, and cost to reservoir managers, and particularly in the committee's mind for those reservoir managers who were in the third or voluntary sector. And there were a number of those in that position. So the Act received royal assent in July 2015. And there were, as I said, notable changes. A couple of ones just I've picked. The primary one and the major one being that the Act was going to commence on a phased basis. It didn't all come into force. And one of the primary considerations there was that the department were to conduct an audit to establish the status and the condition and the costs of the reservoirs identified. And as you can see at that time, we were talking really a number of about 151 was the department's estimate. The other thing that was being done at that point was that the committee did secure a change to reservoir designation from risk to consequence. So, and that was quite a convoluted process, but the committee were content with what they secured in that, and indeed when it went to the floor of the House, that received agreement as well. There's also the removal of a prescribed minimum requirement for supervising engineer visits. That actually now just became a power that was there for the department to set by regulation. And there was the inclusion of a new requirement for an operational review report 3 years on after royal assent. Now that's just a very quick summary. There were more changes. Those are ones I picked out. As part of the phased approach in 2016 and 2015, Rivers Agency then undertook a reservoirs review and an audit, and you can see on the timeline there, this meant that the actual number of reservoirs being considered dropped to 131. Of those, effectively, Rivers Agency did an audit. 119 or 120 were assessed, and 45 of those were in poor or very poor condition. And Annex 1 of your paper sets out what poor or very poor condition actually constitutes. As I said, when actually further analysis by the department actually got the number for which they had very serious concern around down to 26. And at that time too, the department's assessment of the cost of repair for safety related works based on the 2016 audit proposed an approximate figure of £10 million. There was, as you can see, subsequent audit activity in 2019, 2020 and 2021. To all intents and purposes, what that has got us to is that there were 11 reservoirs that were identified as requiring urgent action, and the majority of those were privately owned, with one being managed within the third or not-for-profit sector. I should say a theme throughout this period as well was the move from 12 to 9 government departments in 2016 saw a need to transfer statutory functions from their old to their new department, and reservoirs fell within that purview. They had been with DARD, and the intention was to move them to obviously the Department for Infrastructure. Those functions were, however, omitted from the order that delivered that change, and as a consequence, the actual transfer of powers and functions didn't occur until June 2021. So there was a bit of a limbo there in terms of the department that was meant to own these didn't have them until June 2021. There was also, as you will be aware, I'm not going to rehearse, there was significant political instability and disruption between that period, and that also impacted whatever department's ability to bring forward commencement orders or regulation to deliver the full provisions under the Act. And I think that was a challenge that I think the department has spoken to in previous as well. So in the absence of full commencement of the provisions, DFI did make a number of interventions around practical applications, particularly in relation to strategic planning policy for development of proximity to reservoirs. You can see there were two effectively interventions there in 2018. There was a technical guidance note, and that was updated then in 2020 to it was a technical advice note that became a technical guidance note in 2020. In that most recent iteration of 2020, these provisions have sought to deliver a short-term pragmatic approach in the absence of the full implementation of the Act. And that works in the concept of responsible reservoir manager and condition assurance. I should also just say that a significant thing I included there was the fact that Northern Ireland Water announced a £6.4 million investment in major reservoir improvements in 2021. And that scheduled work was to see 36 reservoirs being improved that were owned by NI Water, and that work was scheduled to complete in September 2024. DFI has also, within the purview of this committee, I suppose, consulted on proposals to commence sections of the Reservoirs Act. That was done in 2021. And I suppose, whilst there was a broad endorsement for the decision to bring those powers forward, there were concerns around financial assistance and about the lack of detail around that, and that was a key concern for many respondents. You've also obviously recently too got a briefing on the 3 commencement orders and 2 sets of regulations. I'm not going to deal with those at the minute. I think the thing is probably just I will close on that point is the fact we currently have 176 controlled reservoirs according to the department. So you can see how the figure has changed over time. I suppose just as a couple of concluding points, despite the full provisions or obligations of the Act not being in place at present, reservoir managers continue to have a common law responsibility for reservoir safety. And more specifically, they have a duty to manage, monitor, survey and maintain a reservoir. That does raise, I suppose, an obvious question as to whether reservoir managers, whilst they might be facing obligations under the legislation, they may also be afforded additional protection if the bill was fully, or the Act was fully commenced and the provisions within it. As I say, there has been change in the number of reservoirs over the period that we've looked at. We've gone from 151 to 131 to 179 to 176. That has made, I suppose, the assessment of control reservoir capital and ongoing operational costs hard to determine in the Department's defence. And indeed, that there, I mean, with the bill comes into force, it's not inconceivable that more reservoirs may actually appear, as managers are required to register them. The approximate figure of £10 million was identified in 2016. DFI have estimated this figure as potentially being in excess of 13.7 million in 2025. But we don't know, or I don't know at this point, if that includes or excludes the 6.4 million that NI Water have committed. As I said, there do appear to be 11 reservoirs which were the particular concerns around. DFIA data that I did receive suggests there was remedial activity at those reservoirs, but there's no confirmation from a suitably competent reservoir engineer to verify that any works undertaken would meet engineering standards relevant to reservoir safety. And I did reference the fact that there have been pragmatic approaches to trying to deliver planning in proximity to reservoirs. I haven't been able to assess the actual overall operational impact of those solutions though, on the levels of development and proximity to reservoirs. And my final point, I suppose, and this takes me back to almost where I began in 2014. At that time, the number of reservoirs, their condition, the cost of potential remedial action and responsibility for those matters were a major issue of concern for the ARD Committee, as was the potential level and nature of public grant support. And those issues, I suppose, in many instances are still live today. So thank you for your time. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mark. I think the most interesting thing from the research paper was the fact that the concerns of the committee back in the day, I suppose, are still the concerns that are live to us today, which I think is the most interesting thing around it. And the fact of there still doesn't seem to be many answers to sort of negate some of those concerns that the committee has, whilst we're not taken away from the fact that this is about public safety as well, so it's trying to get the balance in relation to that. Can I just ask, contained within your briefing paper, it says that the Rivers Agency stated their intention to present the full reservoirs audit to the Assembly in 2016, yes. But you haven't been able to access that report, so it hasn't been published anywhere. There's been no record of that. It definitely did take place, but it's just the fact of nobody seems to have any sight of this.
My understanding, Chair, at that time was that there was a behind closed doors briefing for the ARD Committee.
Okay.
But by the very nature, as you will be aware, reservoirs being critical infrastructure, and I suppose particularly in terms of any information which might enable people to identify where specific elements were, there were considerations which I think impacted upon the ability to publish. So I suppose the headline figures that came out of that have been in the public domain.
Okay.
At various junctures, and indeed I've noted that DFI officials have referenced, for example, the costings are in fact the 45 reservoirs at that time that were in very poor condition. But beyond that, no, you're correct, there isn't in the public square a published report that I have been able to access.
Just thinking of committee point of view, that might be something just we might want to check on to see if that's something that we can get access to, just obviously to inform ourselves on. And there doesn't seem to have been any further am I right in saying that there's been nothing further since 2016?
Well,
so
2019, 2020 and 2021,
Yes.
there was audit activity. So
Yeah.
say that moved down from 45 to 26 to 11.
yes,
So the 11 are in the format in which that is, I don't know if that was published in reports or
Yeah.
if it's simply just an audit that was undertaken. There's bound to be, I'm assuming there's a paper record of it
Yeah.
at some level, but to my knowledge there's been no briefing
Mm-hmm.
on the full detail of any report that might have been prepared.
so it would just be interesting to see the differences as well, and compare and contrast between the 2016 and then obviously the intervening periods of time, and the audits as well. Maybe might be useful for the committee's point of view to see that.
Yes, how that has developed, I understand.
Yeah, can we agree that
Yeah.
now, just
Yeah,
as
yeah.
an action? Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing I just wanted to check was in terms of common law, which is in place at this moment in time.
Yes.
Have you come across or seen anything in the research that you've been conducting, whether that's actually been used or in any of the incidences, that there may be? Because we're talking about high consequence and all of that, but yeah, some of this legislation still has to be enacted. So do you know of any episodes or incidences where common law has been used?
It wasn't within the purview of the paper chair,
Yeah.
so to be honest, it wasn't something like that. But I remember back in 2014, again, this very issue was rehearsed.
Yeah.
Because there was that concern as to what was it that people's current obligations were, even in the absence of a bill at that time. So I mean, it does go back to that case from 1868, which actually does specifically, it related to a reservoir
Yeah.
that was built on land, and there were effectively mine shafts which had been under the bed of the reservoir. Water leaked in and flooded the coal mine. And I suppose in simple terms, that really established at that time, I think it was a general responsibility around liability. I mean, I have just bear with me a minute. Yeah, the implication was that it set a precedent really for imposing strict liability for inherently dangerous activities, which meant that if someone engaged in an activity that is potentially dangerous and something goes wrong, causing harms to others, they can be held liable. And it was in that context that the reservoir, I suppose, which had been built, and effectively the harm that resulted to effectively the coal mines that were flooded, or it could there could potentially have been houses or businesses downstream. So that's, I'm not aware or haven't looked at, but I mean you're kind of getting out of my area as well, because I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah.
But that, I suppose, in summary is the basis of the case, and that is what from 2014, and I remember that distinctly, the department made reference to as common law consideration, and that was the basis.
And then can I just check for some more detail around the deliberations, I suppose, that the committee had in changing the risk to consequence, because
Yes.
I think that's quite important as well, because for some, particularly private, who may be deemed as medium or high, that still is a consideration that they have to take account of, particularly when you think about the grant. And I mean, the committee have been hearing about dewatering and things like that, so obviously there's that environmental concern there too. So was that part of the deliberations around changing that from risk to consequence, or the reasoning behind that, I suppose?
From memory, it was, Chair. I think it was as much semantic around the fact that high risk, in any of our parlance, you would assume, it's going to fail.
Yeah.
Whereas the reality was something could be high risk but in very good condition. And at that time, from my memory, it was the committee's effort, I suppose, to effectively try and provide language which actually reflected in their mind what was the reality. So a massive reservoir of 50,000 plus cubic metres could have a high consequence, could be very well built and very well maintained, so it was unlikely to fail. So it was effectively trying to inform and educate in some ways as to how effective that has been. That's beyond my pay grade, but that was the consideration at that time, was that it was almost the red flag that high and medium risk are implied to some, that maybe that meant these things are going to go overnight, whereas that wasn't the intention. And I think that clarification was accepted even by the department at that time.
And then consideration around the fact of, obviously there will have been potentially work remedial work would have taken place, and you sort of mentioned that as well. But still, an engineer would have to come and assess that regardless of whether the department has signed that off. Right. Did the committee have any concerns about that in and around that time, around the, I suppose, the fairness, if I can say that, because, you know, they still had to employ somebody who had to come from England, so that was at a cost to them.
You're right, and I think particularly in relation to supervising engineers, and I highlighted in the paper, the original bill as was introduced was prescriptive about the number of visits that a supervising engineer would have to make to a medium and high risk reservoir. That actually was taken out, so it effectively the committee did believe, and they heard from quite a few stakeholders, that at that time the bill was effectively, in some people's eyes, an over engineering charter, which effectively was this required, was the question. And I think the department and the minister in fairness did reflect on that. And effectively the minimum level was taken out. So effectively the power was given to the department to make regulation. They can make common regulation, but effectively the power to have a minimum number of visits over a minimum period was removed.
Okay. Cahill?
Thank you, Chair Mark. You're very welcome. We've been dealing with a lot of things down through the years, me and you, Ryan. We've been round the corners, but see, I'm just trying to get a better understanding. I mean, it would be a fair assessment to say we know exactly what status now. And I understand we need to get an engineer in now to do a full report. But after all these years, we have a fair idea. Well, I think we have a fair idea of the number of reservoirs, right?
Yep.
Would we not know how the status of all the reservoirs up in 2025?
I think the department's audit activity has, I think it gives them a degree of, I'm not here to talk for them, I suppose for them to say, but I think they would have a degree of confidence in, you know, the fact that, for example, we're at 11, and the fact that they have a broad figure for potential financial costs for those, yes, would suggest that they have a reasonable idea.
Yeah, and I asked in the context because we're bringing legislation in, whether you say high, medium or low, whatever the case may be, that's all going to be clearly defined. And it's like you said, the question was what standard did they bring it up that? Generally that, and the other issues obviously was the health and safety issue. Obviously we heard from the anglers and those people who use the public who use it. But say in terms of, probably my main question for you is, in terms of, obviously the funding package is a major issue. But is it private versus public? Because NAW have some, council have some, there's other ways to generate, you know what I mean, there's responsibilities there. So are we saying in the major bracket of private ones, those are the ones that, in your experience, in the conversation we've been having, those are the ones that we may have most.
Well, I think again, I said the 11 are predominantly privately owned, and there's one which is third voluntary sector. So I mean, those are, I suppose, theoretically people who are less best placed to afford, and that's where I suppose, particularly in the consultation that was done in 2021, that was reflected in people's concerns that those who are maybe least able to pay were those who are going to be most in requirement of grant aid, and that's where the concerns lie. So you're right.
Oh no, it's just, I'm just trying to get better on some, because at some point we'll move the legislation. Those are the kind of questions we have in ourselves. There was a good body of work done, but it's around a long time now. But thanks very much for your paper. I mean, all right, Chair, thank you.
Andrew?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the paper. It's pretty comprehensive and a lot to get through and go through. Just one of the things that was apparent at the last meeting that we had from the evidence from the anglers and has been for is just and again we said the number between like 170 and then fluctuates up and around about. It's sort of triggering my head a wee bit, because one of the things that rises is the communication between the owners and possibly the managers. And just what the research, and again judging by your previous knowledge in this, and that's also very useful for us too. I mean, is that something that's continually raised, or has that been an issue? Is that something, I mean, or what are the...
It's not, I'll be honest, it's not something I have looked at, and I suppose in terms of the actual process of what was undertaken, I suppose the department were the people who engaged, and I suppose I haven't seen in terms of what the methodology was in that regard. It's probably, as you say, probably a question for them, and in terms of how we got to the number we got to. I think that one of the things that I remember very vividly, just to by example, and you will have heard, people maybe perceive something as a pond. I mean, the committee, the Ard committee, I accompanied them. We went to any of your local, the duck pond in Newton Ards. And the duck pond in Newtownards is actually a controlled reservoir. And there's houses built in proximity. So for local parlance, that was simply a pond, but there was more than 10,000 cubic metres in it. As you looked at it, you could see from one side to the other. Wouldn't have been what you perceived to be a reservoir, but as the officials highlighted, if it flooded, well, most of our shopping centre would have flooded. So there's, I think it was part of the challenge in this is people are maybe looking at a body of water and not realising the implication that it is a controlled reservoir. And I suppose that was part of the department's emphasis, was to try and get the message out at that time.
Okay.
Happy enough.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah.
Anybody else? Keith?
Just a quick question. Very good paper, appreciate all that, Mark. I'm confused with numbers, not your numbers, but just department numbers. I just don't know how many there is. I'm going to be blunt, and I don't know who owns them, and I don't know where they're at. And that's not reflection in your paper.
No.
There's all these magic numbers floating about. How do we ever agree anything if we don't know what the number is?
Yeah, and I did and was at pains to point out how the number has changed over the time frame. And I suppose I'm not. It's for the department, I suppose, to say why that was the case. Was it that people came forward? Was it, as I alluded to in speaking to Andrew, maybe people thought, oh, suddenly that might be a reservoir, I need to check. I'm not sure how we have got the fluctuation. I suppose all I know at the minute is we have 176. The department does know the ownership and of those. So, I mean, there is information that they have, and they know locations. We obviously, there's sensitivity around sharing them. We know the paper includes, for example, where they are in terms of district council areas. But beyond that, I mean, you're going to struggle to get that information, I assume, unless it's in closed session. And that was one of the considerations even I had when I was speaking to the department about what I could and couldn't share. So like, I did make the point that number may well change again. If the fill provisions come in, it could go up, it could go down, we don't know. But I think the department is best placed to give you a commentary as to why that has evolved over time. But it's very clear that has changed.
I think there's maybe more questions, not of you, Mark, that we need to ask.
Yeah, no.
Not of you, Mark, right there.
No, definitely. Yeah.
That is very good, thank you. Thanks.
Mark Durkin. So.
Hi, Chair. Can you hear me?
Yep, got you now.
I had to do this on my phone. Thank you for that evidence, Mark. There's a lot of meaty stuff in there, just as if it wasn't complicated enough. I'm not saying that yours has brought more complication, but just more information to digest and try and read across along with or over what we've heard already. Just one wee issue, and it's numbers based, I suppose, as well. But your report identified, or you talk about the 45 reservoirs that had been identified as poor or very poor, and then like further sort of work reduced that down to the fact that there were maybe 26 with serious concerns. Yep. But then elsewhere in the report, you tell us that 48 reservoirs, have no assurance status. DFI need to carry out assessment of flood risk and advise planning, whoever the planning authority is, accordingly. Do we know what overlap there is there between those that are poor and very poor and those where that are still awaiting that flood risk assessment?
In short answer, no, I don't. And again, I could only work with the information I was provided with on that one. And I think that is a very valid question, but it's not one that I have the information to be able to answer at this point.
Yeah, no, that's more worrying. Of course, it's not your fault. You don't have the answer, but it's worrying if there are ones out there, that there are serious concerns about. And that work, that assessment still hasn't taken place. I think they should be in the department's
defence, as I said, the 11 that they deemed were the ones they were most concerned about. There was indication from the department remedial works have been undertaken, but as the paper highlights, that hasn't been assessed by an engineer, a suitably qualified engineer, to know if that remediation work has actually been up to standard. So in terms of how that would impact, for example, around the planning considerations and proximity, that work might mean that those reservoirs might be able to get an assurance? I don't know. I suppose your question in essence, Mark, is are the 11 within the 48?
Yeah, well, those 11, I don't know how they were identified then. Were they identified maybe because planning applications came along in proximity to those and then the work was done, or do you know how they'd been prioritised?
The 11, I suppose, I'm not sure what the motivation was. The 11 were identified through the audit process, so they weren't driven by planning considerations. They were driven simply by trying to establish the condition of the reservoirs. But I think that is a separate almost work stream in terms of how the 45, the 26 or 11 interact with the interim solution that we have at the minute in relation to proximity to development and reservoirs. And that's definitely one for the department. That's above my pay grade, I'm afraid. But I think it's a very valid question.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, Keith, were you looking back in?
Just a quick question. If a developer or a person going to build houses beside one of these, what does the response come back from DFI Rivers, we assume, on the body of water? You know, if you're in a floodplain, you get a response. So what way does that work now?
It's that 3-tier system, Keith, which I allude to in the paper that's set out in the technical guidance note. It's actually on page 110 of your paper. So the short-term pragmatic approach that they're utilising is effectively there's those 3 terms. So there's responsible reservoir manager status, where management and maintenance of the control reservoir is assessed against the requirements of the Reservoir Act 1975, which applies to England and Wales. So if you have that, that's taken into consideration. If you have condition assurance alone, where DFI would consider assurance provided by a planning applicant or others, but will also insist on all matters in the interests of safety identified in a current inspection report being completed, and that's again in line with the Reservoirs Act 1975. And then for those where you don't have sufficient assurance or no assurance on condition, management or maintenance, it comes down to effectively an individual flood risk assessment where the department actively considers. So there's flood risk maps from reservoirs which are in the public domain, and there's additional maps which deal with depth and speed that we don't have access to, so they'll be looking upon those factors for there is no assurance.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Look, that's all that I have on my list at the moment, unless anybody is looking back in on any other points. But I think there are a number of questions still that we need to scope out as a committee to the department as well, and even contain within your report, because I looked even at around the capital investment for NI Water, and we need to find out, has that occurred? And the actual cost of that, and is there any still remaining that need to be done as well? So we know that obviously in the context of Northern Ireland Water funding, so we'll need to check that out as a committee as well. But look, Mark, thank you very much, and we do appreciate the work that you did on it, and it was good to have somebody with some knowledge, having went through it yourself. So thank you, Mark, we really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we agreed that we would check up in relation to the audits, just to compare and contrast the differences around that. Keith, you had said about where each of them are situated. I'm right in saying that. Is there anything else that you want to add to that?
I know we might have to do it in a private session. I'd like to see a map of these reservoirs. There's no reason why we can't get a map, number one, broken down by ownership type. Now, not individual owners, but ownership type, as in council, NI Water, private. The public accessibility to all these, because if somebody gets spooked by this legislation and drains it, then suddenly we're going to have all these people that go walking saying what's happened to our reservoir. So public accessibility, open for use, insufficient, etc., wrote down as a broad point, and then the map indicating medium and high or low risk, whatever that. So effectively a map that we can look at and see. We don't need to know. Yes, it'll have to be a closed session because it'll be privately owned wherever it is, but we need to understand this. I'm getting all these different numbers. I just don't know what the number is. Yeah. And appreciate it could float, but I'm not clear, and I'm concerned about whenever this comes in, if it comes in, that you'll have these places drained, and then people's going to say, what's happened to our lake, or what's happened to our body of water? Yeah. And we were saying, so a simple map would give you a lot of information. That's what I would request, Chair, if we can do that.
Everybody content with that? Yeah. The other thing is just to maybe note for next week, because we will have the officials back up, is to the reasoning behind why and the methodology, I suppose, Andrew, going back to your question around how we've reached those different figures. I think we have been trying to ask that, to be fair, but I think it's good just again to try and get some clarity around that. And even going back to the minister's letter last week that was in our pack, you know, around some of the methodology and in terms of 10,000, but just why there's been such a difference, you know, in the intervening period of time. We can maybe note that as a question for next week. I think that was everything. Mark, did you have anything that you wanted to ask just out of your questions? Just, are you content? You're content? Okay. Lastly, then, on the NI Water, the capital investment, which is included there in our packs, you'll see there on page 112 and 113, just at the start of 113, there were some questions I felt that were useful that we could maybe ask NI Water as well, just around their capital investment into the reservoirs that they have, because the questions are, were all scheduled works completed by September 2024? Is there any work that's currently outstanding? And was the 6.4 million budget allocation sufficient to complete the intended works across the 36 identified reservoirs that they have? I think it'd be interesting to get some information out of that, and it also links back to some of the budget issues that we've been looking at with NI Water as well. So, are you content with that? Just ask those questions of NI Water as well. Yeah. Okay, we'll move on then, folks. Obviously, we'll have next week, we'll be looking at it again with officials. So we'll move on now to item 8, which is update on the Transport Strategy, Department for Infrastructure Oral Evidence. At page 120, you'll see the Clerk's Memo, Department for Infrastructure Transport Strategy to 2035. At page 126, you'll see Department for Infrastructure Transport Strategy to 2035 written evidence. So we welcome to the committee today Sean Kerr, good to see you, James Redmond, Sean, I'll give you a proper title, Director of Transport Planning and Policy, James Redmond, Head of Transport Planning and Modelling, and Andrew McGreevy, who is Transport Planning and Modelling Unit. So members, just as usual, I'm seeking agreement that we get the evidence recorded by Hansard. All agreed, yeah? Okay, thank you. Thank you for coming to the committee today, and obviously this is a big topic, particularly when we're looking at climate change and the obligations with the department as well. So we've obviously read the paper, the draft report, so if you don't mind 5 minutes just to brief the committee, and then I'll come to members' questions. Thank you.
Good morning, Chair and members, and thank you for the opportunity to brief the committee today on the transport strategy. As the Chair said, I'm Sean Kerr, and these are my colleagues James and Andrew. You'll have received a copy of the draft transport strategy, and if it pleases the committee, I'd like to provide just some background to set the context. The department's last overarching transport strategy was published in 2002 and is now considerably outdated. Since then, the department's policy position in a number of areas has been updated through various strategies and policy documents. This has led to key policy messages being spread across various publications. Consequently, it can be challenging for our stakeholders to access and understand our overarching ambitions for a sustainable transport network that provides healthier and better connected communities. Additionally, the transport sector and wider society have undergone significant changes in this time, most notably the recognition of the climate emergency and the Executive's commitments in the Climate Change Act 2022 that has altered the context in which we must plan for and deliver transport here. And this brings me to the reason we are here today, a new draft transport strategy. The strategy will set out a new vision and strategic priorities for our transport system through to 2035. It will articulate the role of transport as a social, economic and environmental enabler, and will establish a set of transport priorities for the department to deliver against. In several areas, this strategy introduces new messaging or significantly updates a previous policy position. Examples of this include reducing the carbon impact of transport, or the vision and validate approach to transport planning. In other areas, the draft strategy consolidates and draws upon existing policies and strategies. For instance, the road safety content is primarily drawn from the road safety strategy for NI to 2030, and the road safety strategy will continue to provide detailed policy messaging for road safety issues. The transport strategy has an important role in the preparation of the new suite of transport plans by providing an overarching strategic context, consistency and rationale for transport decisions. Working with local stakeholders, the transport plans will then translate this into local measures and actions. We have engaged with key stakeholders in the preparation of the new strategy, including the Inclusive Mobility and Transport Advisory Committee and the Consumer Council. Additionally, the preparation of the transport strategy by Transport Planning and Modelling Unit has allowed us to utilise the views of local communities and organisations that we have sought as part of the extensive engagements in the preparation of the transport plans. This engagement has included local authorities, community groups, community transport, the environmental, non-governmental organisations, young people, university students and transport providers. Our colleagues and their policy teams with ownership of specific issues such as community transport regularly engage with their respective stakeholders. The insight from this engagement has been carried back through interdepartmental collaboration as we have prepared the draft strategy. As I have outlined, this is a draft strategy for consultation. The draft strategy covers many important issues affecting people's lives. The purpose of the consultation is to generate debate on these issues, improve our strategy and ultimately the transport network. The Department aims to launch the public consultation of the strategy in late May, and we look forward to listening to the views of stakeholders on the future potential of the transport. We are also planning to meet the Community Transport Association later this month with our public transport colleagues to outline the draft strategy and our plans for public consultation. That concludes my remarks. Thank you, Chair.
Super, thank you very much. Always like it when people are within the 5 minutes, so well done there, Sian. Look, just in relation to strategic priority 1, obviously, which is that transport is resilient and sustainable. And I suppose one of the hot topics is how do we create that modal shift? How do we get people to change their behaviour? And I suppose looking at the draft report, it talks about travel demand management, and it says there on point 51 to outline the range of potential measures necessary to manage and shape demand on the transport system. The department will develop a demand management framework. So when do you hope to have that fully developed as part of that, and what are you looking at in relation to measures that may be on the table to create that modal shift, I suppose?
I think it's fair to say our first priorities have been, in terms of the transport strategy, is to do the actual transport strategy, and then in terms of the climate work, to input to the climate action plan. So we're starting to look at this area in terms of the framework, but I think it's fair to say that measures to look at how we best utilise the capacity we have on the road network have already been considered and linked into the likes of the transport plans. I don't know, James, if you want to say a bit more in terms of some of the practical examples and I suppose the range of things that demand management might cover.
I suppose in terms of demand management itself, in terms of sort of it's like a 3-pronged attack, so it's not one size fits all or just one package of measures, kind of way. So there's sort of 3 sort of real headline titles in terms of that creation of capacity. So in terms of when let's talk about creation of capacity, that's what we're looking at in relation to the reallocation of road space. They also, in terms of there's a network management aspect to that, in terms of how we can use technology better to inform and know, and also in terms of ticketing in relation to, so that these aspects all come under that demand management framework. And then you also then have the behavioural change. So you have a sort of a 3-pronged attack with a wide range of options underneath each one of the options. And I suppose in terms of the demand management and the actual development of the framework itself, it'll be scalable depending on the location. In relation to, obviously, Belfast very different from sort of your rural in terms of Fermanagh and Omagh. So in terms of it's looking at and understanding in terms of the needs within each one of those local areas, and looking at a suite of measures in relation to how we can influence that travel, be it in relation to promoting the modal shift in relation to making alternative modes of transport, but also in terms of parking in relation to how we can make that long stay car parking less attractive, but in terms of ensuring that in terms of the needs in relation to the short term parking in other areas is still accounted for. But in relation to, I think it's just that three-pronged attack in terms of the network capacity, the management of that in terms of technology and ticketing, and then also in relation to then that behavioural change and how we can influence that and change that mindset for us in relation to that the car doesn't necessarily always need to be the main source, main route or main mode of choice, for all our journeys.
I suppose what I'm getting at too is the fact that some of those policies may be the most controversial for people. So, how does that community engagement piece happen when this strategy is going to be 2035 is quite a short space of time to ensure that there's a resource put in to some of that community engagement work and people understand what's happening, particularly when you're looking at movement of road space and what that means for people as well.
If I may provide an example from your own constituency, so we are working in the Fermanagh and Omagh Transport Plan, and within that we're looking at measures which fall within demand management, and we don't need to reach into measures such as, say, road tolling or things like that, which are headline grabbing. We can look at the more simple measures such as bus priority and think how they link into the other developments that are happening in Fermanagh and Omagh, such as the Strual campus. How we can look at bus priority on the route up to that school, which would give priority to public transport and encourage more students even to use public transport services to the school, and then also linking that within how we can get people from how we can make the smaller rural settlements make their public transport provision better through rural mobility hubs, that people are encouraged then to use the public transport service from rural areas into the town and then up to the school. So it's about large and small measures, and we're doing that we've engaged at the start of the transport plan process. We're engaging with the members in the council. We'll engage again with key stakeholders before we go to public consultation, in particular the voluntary and community sector. And then we have our public consultation process itself, which we should never underestimate the importance of that process as the main driver to really get comments back in. So as we work through the processes, if we're looking at big measures, lots of engagement, lots of opinion, but we can also work on the ground with those smaller measures with the local people that are affected. I hope that makes sense.
So here's a controversial question. So, obviously I come from a rural constituency, which I'll touch on again, but we obviously have the vets in place here in Northern Ireland, and it's, charging infrastructure is going to be very important in terms of what we have to enable people to move and make that switch to electric vehicles. How will then, in urban areas, as I suppose I see it, there is more opportunity for use of public transport, there is more opportunity for active travel, for all of that. So how do you disincentivize people in those urban areas to switch maybe to that electric vehicle? And then as part of that, how do you make sure the rural areas have that increase of charging network? Because I've looked at the figures for Fermanagh and Omagh is poor in terms of the charging infrastructure that we have there to play catch up.
I think it's probably worth separating out into two different issues. So I think, we have the issue around the need to decarbonise in terms of our legal duty, and we have an issue in terms of congestion in our urban areas. And I think if we think of those as two different problems to solve, the solutions are slightly different for each. So when we look at decarbonising transport, the answer is predominantly decarbonising cars and the switch over to electric vehicles. Where we're talking about demand management, we're probably more in the space around how we are addressing congestion by encouraging people to use modes that better utilise road space. So one bus will take up roughly the space of, 4 or 5 cars, but there'll be 80 people on it. And so that is where in the urban areas, the demand management comes into play, because we want to prioritise and use some of the road space for the likes of bus priority. And we want to bring in more active travel as well. And unfortunately, we only have the limited road space that we have available. We can't keep widening roads. So I think that the congestion issue is more predominant, clearly, within our urban cities and towns. We don't want to see a scenario where, cars, we focus in on EVs and suddenly everybody's driving in EVs in our urban centres and congestion is just as bad or worse. That is not where we want to get to. But we fully understand and recognise that in our rural areas, there aren't the options available around public transport, and that, we recognise that the car is very much here to stay in terms of contributing as part of the journeys. And then we look to the EV transition, and we're up again in terms of the committee in a couple of weeks' time, but the issues around public charging are slightly different in our rural areas, because most people have access to driveways and most people will choose to rely on home charging. In our urban areas, where we tend to have more terraced houses, less road space, less off-road parking, then it becomes a wider issue. So hopefully that addresses the question. But yes, it is controversial potentially, but we, as Andrew has said, all of the work we do is through lots of engagement and lots of consultation, so none of this will happen overnight, and it will not be a blanket approach.
Which brings me on, I suppose, to the second priority, which is the connected and inclusive communities, and how we improve the public transport that is available in those rural areas. It will come as no surprise to you the frustration that I have around the All-Ireland Strategic Rail Review, that Fermanagh is not included in it. My concern is that we have a document to 2035. 10 years is going to be when it'll be reviewed in terms of Fermanagh, and just ensuring that we have that definitely in writing, that we are going to review it and that Fermanagh could potentially be included, because we don't want to see communities left behind either in any of these documents. And whilst I understand everything is about chicken and egg, it's important that we have that focus in rural areas so that they're not left behind when we are looking at the overall picture. Mm-hmm. Is that something that will potentially be included in the final document? Obviously, you're looking at the transport plans with Fermanagh and Omagh.
If I may, so having the same team producing the transport plans as producing the strategy has provided a great opportunity for us to be able to look at the strategy through the lens of what we're experiencing and the views that we're getting from local stakeholders in places like Fermanagh and Omagh. So we have heard first-hand accounts about the challenges that people have in rural areas around public transport. So we have taken those views and we've reflected them up into the strategy through our work in the transport plan. It's a strategy, so it's at the higher level. But then that's our views, and making sure we've built that into the strategy then allows that then to flow back down and provide the context for our transport plans when we go to publish. So this is a overarching strategy. It's not to get down into the detail of the strategic All-Ireland Rail Review, but we do pick up on the fact that that in the areas not covered by the Rail Review, that there is the opportunity to provide bus connections to link into developments on the rail network, and that is something that we're picking up within the Fermanagh and Omagh transport plan. So that is very much in our focus as we look at the local measures. So the timing between these things are off because the strategy and the plan are happening at the same time. Ideally, we would have the strategy first, but it has provided that opportunity for us to take that insight, to listen to them concerns about rural connectivity, and we are building that in to the local transport plan.
So I get that there are bus connections, I get that, but does that not mean that we're accepting failure here, that we're saying, it's okay for that county to be left without rail, which is, to be fair, probably one of the most decarbonised ways of public transport. Are we sort of saying it'll be bus only for the next 10 years before we have got to the review in 10 years?
So for the strategy, again, it's where the strategy sit. We're not here to cover the detailed policy area of rail. Obviously, that is public transport policy and public transport operations. That's not to shirk our responsibility in that area as transport planners. But it's understanding, if we come back to the strategy itself, and it sets out the detailed work that has happened in that area, and obviously there has been a decision, that document is published and there's been a decision on that. So the transport strategy is not revisiting that, but does reflect the commitments that the Minister has made in that area. I hope we have captured that, including how then we address connectivity in those places not covered by the Strategic All-Ireland Rail Review. It is in the strategy, and that does set the direction for our transport plans.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I suppose in terms of, I suppose the purpose in the strategy and the reference to the All Ireland Strategic Rail Review, and that strategy is to sort of set the context of where we are, know in relation to what rail is, and then just in terms of the All Ireland Rail Review, and essentially is that it takes you out to 2050. So that, but in relation to that, they've outlined short, medium, and long term sort of rail infrastructure projects over that time. None of those schemes are shovel ready. In terms of there's still a lot of work to be undertaken in that. And I suppose in terms of when you look at the transport plans and the timeline, the timeline in relation to our transport plans out to 2035, I suppose they're related to in terms of that population growth and that employment growth. There is a review and monitoring mechanisms within that in terms of we will revisit that in relation to understanding in relation to where we are at a certain time, and also in terms of when you relate to the sort of the climate aspect of that, in terms of what needs. I suppose what Andrew's sort of alluding to in relation to the public transport element is in terms of currently the short-term measures are the bus. That's the sort of workhorse where we can actually move people around. But in terms of, to answer your question, Chair, I suppose in relation to it's the All Ireland Rail Review takes you to 2050, but there's nothing to say that we won't be revisiting, and looking at in relation to what rail looks like in 5 years, 10 years time in relation to whether that picture changes.
Okay, so I just want to move on then in terms of your meeting community transport associations next month, did you say?
End of this month.
End of this month. So when we had evidence, I suppose, community transport associations, they sort of feel that they weren't maybe involved in development of, or conversations that I have had with my local community transport association, feel like they haven't been involved in development of the transport strategy. Do you feel that that's a fair assumption from the community transport associations?
Well, I think in terms of we recognise, in terms of the fact that they felt that way, and that is why, we have joined that meeting to talk to them about the transport strategy. I think, as I said in my opening remarks, we have worked with various parts of the department who do engage regularly with the sector and fed that back. And I think, hopefully you'll see the content in the strategy on community transport, and that will hopefully address their concerns. It is going out for public consultation, and, obviously we are very happy to hear any comments back.
And
I think we recognise the role that they play.
Yeah, and in terms of TransLink, the engagement that has taken place with TransLink and developing the transport strategy as well, can you touch on that, just how the level of engagement that might have taken place there before the draft?
Yeah, so we would engage with TransLink regularly in many aspects of the work that we do. TransLink are involved in the development of some of the local transport plans as well. So, on the sort of during the process we have engaged regularly. They will also get a copy of the strategy, in terms of before it going out. Do you want to?
No, I suppose in terms of, and you're probably aware, Chair, in terms of there's a number of reviews ongoing, in terms of between the department and the TransLink, and I suppose in relation to where this strategy is trying to set that and point to those reviews, because in terms of where we've kept it high level to and pointed to the fact that those reviews are ongoing, but in relation to the outcome of those reviews is unknown. But in relation to we always were continuously engagement with TransLink and other providers in relation to trying to set the scene in relation to that level of direction in relation to where we want to go. So there has been.
Sorry,
Chair. I think it's coming back to that point at the start to realise that our team, we've pulled together a strategy from across our department. The actual body of work in community transport is being done in the Phase 1, Phase 2 review of community transport. So it's not for the strategy to step past that work or to try and take that work on. That work is continuing by those teams. And there was a lot of engagement within that, and that's pulled into the strategy. And then the other work we have, we got a lot of really insightful engagement from community transport providers in Fermanagh and Omagh. They've done a lot of work on rural transport poverty in Fermanagh and Omagh. And so we are aware of that. And again, it's because our team is working on the plans and this strategy. So we feel, even though we haven't engaged with Fermanagh Community Transport directly on the strategy, between our teams in community transport, between our work on the transport plans, we feel like we have an understanding of their issues and the policy area. But importantly, we're going to public consultation. Yeah. Again, not to really diminish the role of a public consultation in the process of producing a policy or strategy.
And that's encouraging to hear that, you know, you've taken that on board in terms of that transport poverty that there is, because there has been a huge amount of work done locally in relation to that. So I'm glad that that's being taken on board. Just lastly for me, obviously we have our climate change targets, and obviously this strategy will sit within some of that and looking at that. So how likely is it that the 2030 greenhouse gas emissions target as set out in the Climate Change Act 2022 will be met, and is it envisaged that the department will be on track for the 2040 target by 2035, because it's quite a target to meet?
Yeah, so I think the important thing is that those 2030, 2040, 2050 are collective targets for all of Northern Ireland emissions. They're not for each sector. Yeah. So we have provided, as part of the DAERA-led process on the Climate Action Plan, we have provided the quantification for transport and how we see transport decarbonising and the rate at which that will decarbonise. And we fed that in to that consult, or to the development of that document. We are the second biggest sector at the minute, so we clearly have a key role to play. But yes, we are of a view that by 2050, which is the legal target, that transport will largely be decarbonised, which has to be the case if we are collectively to meet our wider targets. So, but we're very happy to provide much more information on that. I think we've got a session in a couple of weeks' time. Yeah.
So. Okay. I'm going to move to Cathal.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's a big challenge for us all. I'm just wondering, I mean, and I know we're going to consultation, just probably my big question would be how the strategy is going to address those issues for rural people in general. I mean, I know that, and I know you may not have engaged with outside bodies, but you recognise, even with your own policies and reports in different sections of the department, you know, other departments are playing a big role as well, have a big part to play. The councils have a big part to play. The likes of the taxi industry will have a big part to play as well. I take it you're talking to your own departmental officials who are dealing with all those sections to develop all this. But my main question, I mean, if we know 70% of the people are using cars, we know a lot of them's coming down the motorway. Have we clearly identified, and I know the stats here, which is fine, and I'm not arguing the stats, you know, have we clearly identified those shorter journeys that we should be encouraging to use public transport? Because that's where a big challenge. I mean, if you're talking about a 5 mile radius or Greater Belfast or whatever, it's easier to get those people to use incentivise those people to use public transport, as opposed to the serious reliance from rural people on single car use. There's no point in arguing that point over the next 10 years if we're serious with that. So that's my point, and as part of the consultation, that's the message. That's the broader conversation that the strategy should be bringing out.
And it'll come as no surprise that our Minister is very clear in terms of the role the department needs to play around regional balance, and also the role, the difference, I guess, between the challenges faced in our urban and rural areas. So that has very much been in our thinking. And I think I alluded to earlier the fact that, you know, we recognise that the opportunity to switch people from cars to other modes of transport is probably greater in our urban areas. We are not... You know, we have made it very clear that there is a role for a decarbonised car in the future.
I'm not even arguing that. That's climate change.
Yeah.
That's like, you know, that's part of the strategy. That's,
absolutely.
I'm just, you know.
But I think, you know, in terms of, you know, James can come in terms of, we recognise that there are shorter journeys that are, and a huge number of very short journeys that are prime examples where potentially somebody could shift to a different mode. I think part of the challenge, and you'll see in terms of, I think it's figure 9 around the Consumer Council feedback, is that a lot of those journeys people consider to be quite complex. So there may be, you know, in that relatively short journey, there may be doing the shopping, picking up the kids and going to work, you know, and I think it's that sort of how we make those journeys more easily done under public transport. James, I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, no, I suppose in terms of just the transport strategy, I suppose what we're trying to do is provide those policy hooks, you know, in relation to the why and the what, and then I suppose when we look at the transport plan, where we've got the level of detail in relation to what that looks like, and in the context of the locality in terms of Belfast, Fermanagh, Newry, you know, Derry's Road, Londonderry, kind of way. Although in terms of each will have their own case for change, on need for transformation, and I suppose there'll be scalable levels in relation to how we influence that level of travel, in terms of based on the objectives that we want to bring forward. But in terms of bringing it to the transport strategy itself, I suppose the last one was 2002. We've been in the absence of having of one document to sort of point to that direction and give you that rationale of the why and the what. In terms of this is what we're trying to do here. So in terms of when we talk about the local councils, when we talk about ourselves, everybody has that direction of travel and everybody has that consistent understanding of why we're doing. And some may be difficult, but in relation to there's an understanding there in relation to the why we want to do it and what the vision is. In terms of that.
Oh no, appreciate that. And basically, I mean, the strategy has to be providing the right direction to get the right answers. Do you understand me? So that then when we formulate it after the consultation. Sorry, do you want to come in? Sorry.
Oh, there's an important thread throughout the strategy, which is partnership, and that runs right through demand management and those shorter journeys. Because as a department, we have some of the levers to be able to create the change in this area. We can look at public transport services, but it's important to recognise that there are other partners who have large levers in this area, particularly our councils have large, have a lot of sway. And through the strategy outlines the partnership working, and a lot of that comes through in the transport plan process again. When we look at their local development plans and their community plans, that they've actually put a lot of effort into creating and setting a vision for their area. So we can look into those documents to see how are they visioning the switch to more sustainable modes of travel. And then there's also the recognition that although we have some levers, they also have levers in areas such as their off-street car parks. So it's that partnership working where we're going to see that real change, because we can't, as public authorities, we can't do it all ourselves, council and the department. We need the public involved in that too. But as a department, we certainly can't do it alone. So it's that partnership working which is central in the strategy, and we hope that.
And I hope that, because that's what I'm getting at. I mean, there's plenty of partners play the role here, but you mentioned the area plans and everything else. So hopefully within the next 10 years, most of them have. But that's going to play a key role in how. My other part, and just the final point, because the chair has raised this, and you mentioned community transport. I mean, we've talked to community transport. We know the journeys to do. We know the sports to do. But there's health journeys and there's education journeys. All that collectively the broader conversation needs to be had. Now's the time to do that. I understand you may not have engaged with all those, but we already know that. We've been 20 years or more talking about congestion and everything else and things. So those are the kind of things that I hope, and reading through the strategy, that's coming out, and we're going to get the right proper answers to some of that consultation. That's my key element. And I'm hoping he's had, and I assume he's had all those conversations. But community transport in particular have played a big role. They're doing journeys that are the responsibility we could ask, are the responsibility of somebody else, to be honest. So I mean, as long as that's the direction of travel, pardon the pun. Okay. All right. Thanks, Chair.
Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question, Chair. This is maybe of relevance to you as well, just from the meeting we were at last night. You're referencing this young people, and I'm thinking as well that young people are some of the people that are maybe precluded from certainly private transport. I mean, how has young people's considerations and young people's and I'm thinking sort of that sort of up to 25 age group necessarily, not just sort of children and such, but how has that been, and how would you envisage that it's taken further, given that there would be a fairly big cohort of this?
Andrew, come in on this.
Through our transport plan process, we're talking a lot about plans in our strategy, but it's our joint work. In the transport plan process, so as we were developing our plans, we went into primary schools and secondary schools to try and inform about sustainable transport, but also to talk about the issues in the towns where we're producing the transport plans. So we tried to we have actually so far have a mix of primary, secondary demographics, schools that use selection, schools that don't use selection, to get that wide range of views. The department's also held a session in Queen's University to talk about transport issues, and so that's how we've tried to get those views in. It's telling those sessions. We asked in unnamed grammar school, when you were in third year, who got the bus to school? and I'd say 4/5 of the hands went up. And then this was a lower 6th year, so then who now takes a private car?
I can imagine.
And a sizable portion of those hands went down. And so then as we're developing our transport plan and we're looking at this strategy, there's clearly, for these people, it's more convenient to be able to take a car. And so how do we improve those sustainable modes? So it's a consideration. There's not easy answers to that, but it is a consideration that, again, it's in the transport plans, and because we're looking through that lens, we hope that at a strategic level comes up into the transport strategy. But it is a very important cohort that we have considered, and it's an enjoyable part of the consultation process, engaging with them, because you never know what feedback you're going to get. So it's an
You never know what feedback you'll get from the committee either.
You may go and redesign the strategy.
I suppose there's just an added point to that in relation to, I suppose, in terms of shaping this strategy itself, and even in terms of the plans. I suppose what we did engage with, myself and my colleagues, we've been into the local universities, Andrew said Queen's, but also Jordanstown, but looking and talking with their sort of planning students, because in terms of they're going to be the practitioners for the future in relation to, particularly in relation to the message was that in terms of we're developing this strategy, but a lot of those guys are coming out of no university and they're going to be using that strategy or going to be influencing that strategy. So in terms of, we've had quite a lot of heavy engagement with them in the run-up to this strategy, and we've also programmed in, in terms of during the consultation itself, to have that targeted engagement further to try to draw out those ideas and those understands, and also in relation to not everybody's travels is the same. So in terms of understanding the youth of today in relation to why they want to travel back to the complex journey, so we have tried to encompass and bring that in through the strategy itself, and we will continue to do that.
Just a very brief on that subject, but I think the answer on the cars is telling. That's probably a whole segue. Just on the young people there, it was very much sort of formal settings, if I use that term in parlance, if that makes sense. There's also informal education as well, the youth sector. So I'm just saying it might be worth maybe you already have, I don't know.
So it's in as we move around, finding our feet in doing young people engagement and looking at the principles of how we do young people's engagement. So it's actually meaningful that we're not there talking at them. We're engaging with them. So I think we're getting a good momentum in that process to try and get those views in, and we are going to start to look then. We've got a snapshot of views from those primary and secondary schools. Now, how do we expand that out? All things we have to explore whether it's possible, but we're even thinking now special schools. Can we go into a special school and work with the staff there to maybe think, how can we run a session in a special school to get those views? And the views of actually the parents of the pupils in a special school, how do we get those views in? And there is those youth sectors such as Girl Guiding, Scouts, that those are options that are out there. So we're moving that direction to see how we can broaden it out.
Thank you very much. You can't remember. You touched on the another three-pronged approach in infrastructure.
Always threes.
Love the three-pronged approach. Absolutely. No more than three.
Just. I mean, I think from my notes here, it was creation of capacity, technology, and behavioural shifts. I'm just wondering which one of those perhaps creates the biggest challenge, or which one is, there's low-hanging fruit per se, but there's also the real difference, and behavioural, and then we've just touched on name school that everyone drives to. So I'm just curious there, what's the biggest challenge and what's the biggest opportunity?
I don't think anyone, in terms of bumps the other one kind of way, because I think they all come with their own challenges, and particularly in relation to what you're trying to do within the locality of where you're looking to do. I think behavioural change, in terms of is very challenging in relation to changing that mindset, but in relation to the responsibility, I suppose, in terms of one doesn't come without the other. So in terms of that behavioural change, how do we change people's mindset in relation to getting that attractive transport, accessible transport? Well, that requires, in terms of the creation of capacity in relation to that shifting of people, in relation to we've only got a finite road space. How do we best move people along in terms of how can we better utilise that? So in terms of more sort of bus priority, no routes, in terms of we'll create a mindset and a behavioural change to help people get on the bus to do a certain journey. And then, but in terms of the network management, in terms of that technology aspect, we all know how fast-moving technology is now these days. In terms of, I think the challenge comes there in relation to putting all your eggs in one basket and going with a certain technology that very soon becomes out of date. In terms of we look into the future in terms of, we talk about autonomy, and in terms of different ways of ticketing and different ways of just managing parking and things like that. So they all come with the same challenge, but I think in terms of call three-pronged attack or is in relation to they nearly come all at the same time, because they all nearly complement each other, and that, we need to recognise that and make sure that in terms of that comes out.
Thank you. Just one last one, just again touching on some of it's more of a comment, rhetorical, just the rural aspect of it and connection to services, and just how that's included again as someone. Maybe she declare an interest whose wife doesn't drive. Public transport is such an important thing, and only this week we're having issues of getting connected to services. So it's negative, but then that knocks on to everybody else if that can, people will use it better.
And I think that's a really important point. Like, we talk about the car use as if everybody has a car. Large numbers of people don't have any access to a car in terms of a family. So, it is something that we're very mindful of. And, as I said, we are very mindful of the different challenges that people face in rural and urban areas. It's very much not one size fits all in any of this, unfortunately. Yeah. So it's very, very much done on a spatial basis.
Yeah. I think just even on that point, I suppose in terms of when we go to the plans, in terms of is that evidence, the data and understanding in relation to who are the users, in terms of what is the demographic, in terms of is very important, and that's helped shape the plans itself and also sort of those projects and measures that come forward. So in terms of, I think that will all sort of come, the strategy is still quite high level in terms of just points to the aspects of that, but in terms of the transport plans themselves will help try and deal with that movement of people and in terms of, and taking into account of people's in relation to in terms of who they are, their demographics, and also in terms of any disabilities or any no access to or not access to a car.
I'm going to move on. Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, folks, for the presentation and the work you've done. I suppose just to scope out a wee bit about, obviously, there will be a significant cost to delivering this strategy, at a UK level, but also importantly here across Northern Ireland. What level of detail has been done in terms of scoping out projected costs by yourselves?
So I think it's really important that we see this in the space of that high level policy, and that flows from it all the areas like the strategic rail review, community transport review, all these things which themselves are the bits that would be costed. So given that this is just a very high level approach that in many places just replicates what we've already said, the likes of the road safety strategy, so we wouldn't see it all packaged together on an overall cost for the strategy, rather that whenever we get into specific measures and actions, that they are the ones that are costed. So if that it just doesn't really answer the question, but it explains where we're coming from.
The significant fiscal pressures within this department and right across our executive, all our departments. So I suppose it is a key issue, important issue. Within the strategy, talks about alternative funding opportunities. What could they look like?
We're always, as a department, looking at options that might be available. We're very mindful in terms of opportunities that might be available through the likes of the Shared Island Fund, and the likes of Belfast Port are looking at those, and we've also looking at some work with the Department of Transport around hydrogen. So that is one example. We also link in on some of these areas to the likes of the Department for Transport in England, and see what funding is available there. You'll be aware of the availability of grants for EV that colleagues have spoken about before. So we're very much in the space of working with stakeholders and colleagues to ascertain where we can access funding, as well as making the case through the normal budgetary process, in terms of bids.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Congestion charges were mentioned in part of the document. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there was some concern around those. I think it was 70% the feedback was received. Is that correct? So
I think that was through the Consumer Council. I think survey, and I think it was a general reflection on, you know, would you support those? I think it's really clear at the minute that we are not in the space of identifying anywhere specific right now that we would be looking at congestion charges. It was a in theory comment. We do see it as it's one way that other areas have looked to manage the traffic, the likes of Glasgow and London. They wouldn't be They wouldn't be for revenue raising. It's about demand. It's about managing people's behaviours. You know, and I think that the usual sources of where money comes into the department, the likes of parking charges and penalty charge notifications, those are as a result of managing paying for a service. You know, it's not about bringing in money to do other things.
Yeah, well,
specifically on road users charging, that's also not new to this strategy. That's been in departmental policies and strategies for some time, because it's a measure which is there and is on the books and can be looked at. You know, if the evidence and if the transport modelling and the transport plan process says that there's actually a benefit or a need for that type of a measure, then we have the context there within our strategy, which has been carried over from before, that we can, you know, that we can draw on that. So it's not a new measure in this strategy. It's not something which is new or coming forward at this stage now. It has been in departmental policy for some time, that it's just an option that is there. On regards to funding, I think the strategy points out that yes, there is a very challenging budgetary position at the minute, and probably likely to be for some time. And our strategy is realistic. But as we've produced or drafted this strategy with our colleagues, and also as we're preparing the transport plans, we don't want to let that dampen optimism as well. You know, it's important that we create an optimistic vision for transport about what is possible, and that the transport strategy and the transport plans, they present a range of options, a range of measures which can be drawn down from when funding becomes available or when opportunities become available. So I think it's important not to dampen our optimism, or sorry, our aspiration would be a better word rather than optimism. Aspiration is the word we should use.
Well, thanks for that. Just finally, just in terms of the EV or network, you know, where do you think we are with that? I know personally from my own experience within my own area and so on, you know, there is a significant increase in EV vehicles. You know, when you're out on the street or in your own area, you know, you do hear or don't hear so many, you know, EV vehicles nowadays. Yeah. How do you think that's going against your strategy in terms of, you know, how do you read that in terms of both the infrastructure and the number of vehicles?
I don't have the figures with me today, but I will have them for the next briefing. But, you know, where we are is that really since the ESB started charging for the electricity from their charge points, that we've seen a significant growth of the market. That seems set to continue. We see the figures through planning and the like, so we see a pipeline coming on board. We've seen recently a couple of announcements around large charging hubs, which is great. So, and you know, colleagues, I think David, who was up previously before, working very closely with the providers to ensure that we can smooth the process, I guess, in terms of, you know, educating about how to apply and what you need to do, and that goes on. So, you know, generally speaking, I think we are pleased. It's really positive to see the increase in rapid chargers. You know, that's been great. Is there room for more? Of course. We're seeing also a change in how the charging is working. So, you know, rather than hotels, for example, putting them in, they're maybe making spaces available for charge point operators to come in and effectively leasing spaces and things. So that is it's an evolving space, and you know, we have to keep up to speed about how that market's working.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, technology will always evolve as well.
Yes.
You know, in a few years or 5, 10, 15. So okay, thanks for that. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the team for coming along to presenting this hugely important, hugely ambitious, and certainly not easy piece of work, and it must be made more difficult for you, I suppose, and I admire your optimism or aspiration whenever the elephant in the room is the investment or question as to where that's going to come from, the investment that we need to do this. Taking on board some of the issues, I suppose, that have been raised previously, and the electric vehicles. We're not going to change. Everyone who has a petrol or diesel car today isn't going to have an electric vehicle. in 10 years. It's just not affordable for people, never mind the capacity on the network or whatever to deal with it. But so therefore, I think the major focus has to be on public transport, making that accessible, making it more convenient for people, making it more affordable for people to effect that change. And I know there's a kind of carrot and stick approach to that, especially if we hear suggestions around congestion charges or charges for road use. But I'm much more of a carrot man, and would like to see, I suppose, more investment in public transport in order to make it more affordable for people, and establishing where routes can be put on to maximise the impact in terms of, I suppose, reduction of carbon footprint and just convenience for people, reducing congestion in areas. And that, therefore, the partnership piece of work is extremely important. And when Andrew was asking there about young people, and you were chatting about going into schools and all, I think universities is a key area here as well.
Can you come to your question, please?
Yeah, I was wondering what sort of, I suppose, interaction you had with universities where, not exclusively, but a lot of those journeys would be less complex that students are making to university.
Thank you. Well, it's maybe worth picking up a couple of points within that. So, we've spoken a bit about the fiscal environment, and we've spoken about the fact that we haven't had a transport strategy for a number of years. I think there's a really important opportunity within the strategy to, we've maybe tried to please all people before and do everything. And I think, the strategy provides much more of a kind of guiding light in terms of decision making that hopefully helps in an environment where we have less money to actually really focus in on the things that make a difference. So, yes, we are ambitious and optimistic, but I do think having a strategy actually really helps in terms of identifying the things that matter. You talked a bit about the electric vehicle transition, and that not everyone's going to have an EV in 10 years, and we know and recognise that, and they don't have to. So the transition to electric vehicles is up to 2050. We very much recognise that right now there are barriers to people getting electric vehicles, and through the likes of the zero emission mandate and the vehicle emissions trading scheme, we hope to see that some of those barriers in terms of cost will be removed as manufacturers become incentivised to sell cars. So advice most recently from the Climate Change Committee is that we would see parity quite soon in terms of vehicles, and we will obviously be monitoring that to see if that is the case. So hopefully over that time period, we will see that transition, but very much recognise it won't be in the next 10 years. In terms of, do you want to pick up on the university engagement piece? But I think it's worth as well, just even in terms of saying the likes of the University of Ulster in terms of the move to Belfast, like those travel plans and how they work with students to encourage fewer students to drive in and use public transport has been very helpful.
Yeah, I suppose in terms of just the reference in terms of, and it's probably taking this down another level into the transport plans element and those trip journeys and understanding in relation to where those attractors are. And I suppose that as we develop through the transport plans, particularly in terms of your own jurisdiction, in terms of in Derry, Londonderry, in relation to the Magee College, for example, in terms of we're taking on board in relation to those growth projections that are coming forward through that universities, but also understanding and where those potentially people want to come and travel to and where they're coming from. And I suppose that then influences and informs the sort of interventions and bus measures or other interventions or projects that we want to bring forward to help influence in that. So in terms of that engagement is ongoing, whether it's the schools, whether it's the employment, whether it's it's the universities. We really try to get a grasp and understanding in relation to why people are travelling, where they're travelling to, and in terms of how we could influence that away from that car dependency. So.
And I think as well, like we've picked up on a lot of the engagement that's happened already, but I think the key point is that this will be going out to public consultation, and for hopefully at the end of the month, and throughout that as well, we'll also be highlighting the opportunity to feedback and encouraging people to do so.
Yeah, and you'd mentioned it as a potential, I suppose, area where investment might be drawn from the shared island unit. I was wondering, in the transport plan, is there a particular focus, therefore, on cross-border routes? Do you know where that might be? I suppose easier to leverage that funding in.
Yeah, I suppose in terms of in relation to the plans, especially the council areas in locality to the border and things like that, we don't just focus on that Northern Ireland region in terms of we're actually focused in relation to the hubs, across the borders in relation to, for instance, in your own jurisdictions, Letterkenny, looking at those routes and how we can sort of work alongside the NTA, TII in relation to our counterparts in the south, in relation to how we can sort of bring those measures together in relation to and look at that funding opportunities and how we know how we bring in terms of those bus measures or other measures or projects to the fore, and understanding that there is a lot of those cross-border movements and we want to serve both people on both sides of the border.
And it is clearly a massive piece of work, and one that every department has a role to play in. Other people have mentioned health, but education, when you look, I suppose, it's part of the wider community planning piece, I suppose, but the schools admission policies and things like that. Look at the complex journeys that people do need the cars for, and they often entail leaving kids to school or whatever, but to ensure that people and planning is close to where services exist to reduce that dependency on cars. Has there been much of that work done?
I was going to say, one of the things the transport strategy doesn't address is the school's admission policy, but in terms of, it is.
But there is a need for a whole holistic view thing at that, when you have people having to traverse the city to go to a nursery like 10 miles away and things like that.
Yeah, so the strategy reflects policy within the strategic planning policy statement, which already sets out the importance of the integration of transportation and land use planning. And that's when we set up the transport plan process. Our key link into the councils is through the council local development plan teams. So as they're bringing forward their local transport plans, we'll be looking at our transport plans to see where are the zonings coming forward, how can transport link in with that, but also importantly, when they're taking forward zonings, where are the transport connections there at present, because it's easier to link into an existing connection rather than trying to create a new one. So the transport, again, taking it back up into the transport strategy, it does reflect that link between the town planning process, which links back into community planning, and our transport and the transport planning process. And we do have very close working relationships with the council town planners.
Okay, no, thank you. Just one final thing, and that's you'd mentioned a few times priority measures, and I think that's very important. The only way people will get out of cars and onto buses is if they see buses will get them there quicker, as well as cheaper. Currently, I'm unaware of any bus priority lanes outside of Belfast. Are you aware of any plans from elsewhere in the department to pursue these?
It will be considered as part of the transport planning process that we will be looking at bus priority measures. So those plans are in development at the minute. So they will be looked at in places like in Enniskillen and Omagh. They will be looked at in Derry, Londonderry. So we are exploring those issues.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Keith, I'm letting you in very briefly, if you don't mind.
There'll be no preamble with me, Chair. Straight on the questions. I have two specific questions. The Chair and Cathal spoke to with respect to community transport, right? Under CC11, under bullet point 154, it says closer integration of public and private operators in the development of shared infrastructure. So my question is there any integration of those two at the minute? And what is the perfect model, if you could wave a wand, between TransLink and community transport? What's the perfect model?
I think in terms of like that, I think, don't want to step on anyone. So like we have set the high level direction within the strategy. I think, we've alluded to already reviews around community transport and work being undertaken in terms of Ulster Bus as well. And like that, hopefully from those reviews will indicate where better linkages would benefit us.
I suppose in relation to, the purpose of what community transport probably fulfills now is those gaps that in terms of the TransLink, the public transport provider doesn't provide, in terms of they're serving that. I suppose in terms of the perfect model, the perfect model ideally would be that everybody has access to some kind of level of transport to and from wherever they need to get to.
The point is the perfect model between the two. The TransLink's not fighting over the same roadway as community transport. You could have a TransLink bus going up a rural road with 2 people, and 10 minutes later a CTA bus going up with 1 person. That's the point. And
Yeah.
Through the transport plan process, we're trying to retain a degree of flexibility within them, to allow policy to change. So how we are trying to look at it is, where are the connectivity gaps? So you can see there are connectivity gaps in smaller settlements, for example in Fermanagh and Omagh, where there is a connectivity gap in a small settlement or village. And we would like to see that connectivity gap to be able to link into the main settlement. And the stakeholders have told us, for them, a massive issue is accessing healthcare and the healthcare centres, and particularly up to the Auchnagelvin Hospital, which is part of their region. So, again, this is very hypothetical, but within the transport plans, we're looking to just look at the connectivity gap and show where we want to create the connections. And clearly, if there's going to be a connection from a main town up to a major centre like Derry, that's probably an Ulster bus service. But we can point to where the gap is then beyond that, and we want to see where those connections are. So that's I think the strategy is broad and tries to maintain the space for that policy development to happen outside the strategy in the policy teams where that rightly sits. And again, underneath that, our transport plans, we're trying to retain that flexibility in our text and in our approach to allow those policy developments to happen.
Okay, and then final quick question. You talked about electric chargers and people can charge in their own driveway if they have one. Yeah. So where are we at with on-street charging briefly? The issue of the cabling across the footpath. Where's that sitting today, if and maybe it's too specific, but my point.
I do know your point, and certainly, David and the team have been up here speaking about it before, and I'll have an update for you I think it's in 2 weeks' time.
Sorry. We have loads of questions about this on-street parking thing.
And we see it as a major issue that needs addressed, but obviously I think one of the things to really point out, that there's a reason in terms of the legislation being there that doesn't permit cables across roads, and it's for the health and safety of people using the footway. So we need to be very careful that in solving one problem we don't create another. As you can imagine, given the health and safety issue, it's something that we're keen to consider properly and do it right.
Next time it'll be good to get an update on that.
Yeah, no, certainly, there's no problem at all.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Apologies, just we're running over a wee bit of time there, but thank you, because it is a really important issue to all of the constituencies, and we do see it affects everybody. So we'll look forward to seeing the outworkings of the public consultation whenever it gets launched, and then obviously the final plan as well whenever it comes to us. So thank you for your time, and Sian, we'll see you very soon again.
Yes, I know. Thank you.
At least you're under no illusions what the questions might
I know
be.
the questions are right.
You use public transport this time, aren't you?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Okay, members, we're going to move on very, very quickly. There's obviously been a few people that's joined us since. Just to remind you, we do have 2 sessions from DVA. The first one is their business update, and their second is the termination on the contracts. So can you please ensure that your questions relating to the termination of contracts is kept to the closed session? This session will solely be on the business update. I will come in and cut you off, and please ensure that you come to your questions as well, because we are running a wee bit behind schedule and we want to ensure that we use the time effectively. Okay, so item 9 is a business update from the Driver Vehicle Agency. Oral evidence at page 207, you'll see the clerk's memo, which is an update on DVA's performance against its business plan objectives. At page 211, you'll see the DVA business plan 2024-25 Q3 monitoring. So we're welcoming to the committee today. We have Jeremy Logan, Chief Executive of the Driver Vehicle Agency. We have Pat Delaney, Director of Operations, Driver and Vehicle Agency, and Jonathan Furphy, Director of Compliance Enforcement and Licensing, Driver Vehicle Agency. So, as per usual, I'm just seeking agreement that the evidence is recorded by Hansard. All agreed? Yeah.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you. Apologies, gentlemen, for keeping you waiting. Obviously, our time has just run over, but we are very keen to hear from you in terms of the business plan. So I'll give you, obviously, a brief 5 minutes. I will interject because I'm keen to come to members' questions, if that's okay, because we do have some of the information relating to the business plan already in our pack. So
okay.
I'll let you talk now.
Thanks, Chair. I'll keep this very brief. So thank you for the invitation to come to the committee today to provide an update on DVA services. The committee was sent an update on our quarterly 3 progress against our business plan targets, and I will draw out a few key highlights. Our business plan focuses on 3 priorities: our services, our infrastructure and assets, and our organisation. In the quarter 3 update, we reported 12 of 14 targets were on track to be achieved, and that remains the position at year end, subject to validation by internal audit. In 24-25, we conducted more than 1.16 million vehicle tests, which is the highest number we have ever recorded. During that period, the average waiting time for an MOT has reduced from 100 days to around 30 days, set against the business plan target of 6 weeks or 42 days. These positive statistics have been achieved by adopting a range of measures, including the recruitment of additional vehicle examiners, the use of overtime to provide cover for leave, and offering vehicle test appointments on Sundays and bank holidays when testing is not normally available. We also increased productivity by adding an extra test into each examiner's daily work programme. There were only 6 days in 2024 when MOT appointments were not offered. The introduction of temporary exemption certificates for 5- and 7-year-old cars within specified date ranges has helped to keep the demand for MOT tests at a manageable level, and you will be aware that the Minister has recently agreed to extend the use of temporary exemption certificates for a further year to help keep MOT waiting times in check until such times as our new test centres at Hydebank and Mollusk open for vehicle testing. In 2025, we conducted 68,700 driving tests, which is the highest number we have recorded since 2009, and this has helped reduce waiting times to approximately 20 days. Our driver licensing, commercial licensing and enforcement functions have all performed well, and we are reporting the achievement of the related business plan targets in these areas. From an infrastructure perspective, the construction of a second test centre at Mollusk commenced in July 2024 and is programmed to be completed later this year. Our business improvement programme for 2024-25 was successfully delivered, further developing our IT systems and modernising our customer-facing services to make it as easy and as straightforward as possible for customers to interact with us. The only 2 targets we are reporting as not being achieved are the 2 financial targets relating to the agency's trading fund. This is primarily due to the removal of a resource subsidy to help the department manage its resource budget shortfall. We are reporting a deficit of circa £1 million. So we are happy to take any questions you may have today.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeremy. Pat, sorry you weren't in the room whenever we were welcoming you to the committee, but you're very welcome today as well. Look, coming to questions, you said there in your oral evidence there that the Minister is keeping the TECs and a declaring interest, because I am one of those who is in that bracket, in check until the new test centres are up and running. So obviously we've seen beforehand there was delay, there was backlog in the system. So has the TECs been very fundamental and central to the decision making, particularly when you're looking at the test centres not being online at this particular point in time?
Yeah, the TECs certainly have been a key factor in trying to keep the MOTs in a manageable position. I say that aligned to the other efforts that we have done to keep the vehicle testing capacity at a high level and deliver as many vehicle tests as we have done this year, as I say, which is the highest number we've ever done. But without the TECs, certainly waiting times would be more than they are at the minute, and that has helped bring them down from 100 to 30 days in that sort of last 12-month period.
So just obviously there's been a consultation in relation to biannual testing. Is this biannual testing through the back door in terms of TEC? obviously it's worked in terms of bringing down the backlog that there has been in the system. So do you think that's a workable and manageable going forward?
Well, I understand, yes, the department are taking forward the consultation and biennial testing, and that closed, I believe, on the 16th of April. So I expect you will, the committee will be updated on the synopsis of the responses from that consultation. The TECs were introduced, as you point out, with delays to opening of Hydebank Test Centre, which has a capacity of at least 100,000 vehicle tests per year. So it was acknowledging that until that test centre opens, there will be additional pressure on our testing services.
So just in relation to Target 9 obviously relates to Test Centre and Mollusk in particular as well. So when do you anticipate the completion? Construction commenced in July 2024. So when do you anticipate the completion of Mollusk Test Centre?
Yeah, look, I'm pleased to report that the construction is going very well and according to programme at this stage. And we anticipate the contract and the construction contract will conclude in around sort of October of this year. Obviously, there is the potential for some delays, but at this stage it is going according to programme, and we expect the construction to be completed in the autumn.
And that will be around 100,000 added to capacity as well?
Yes, again, it is of similar size to Hydebank Test Centre, and in fact it's slightly bigger. It has two heavy goods vehicle testing lanes, so it will have a similar capacity to Hydebank in terms of testing vehicles.
Okay, and then in terms of the targets, they're relating to financial, and you reported there in terms of deficit of 1 million. I'm also thinking in relation to the amount of overtime and extra capacity that has been put on by DVA in terms of testing. Has that resulted in that 1 million deficit in terms of overtime payment and things like that?
No, well, I think primarily the reason why we're in deficit is because of the removal of the resource subsidy funding from the department for 24-25, and that subsidy is to fund areas where we don't charge fees for, such as our enforcement functions and some elements of driver licensing, such as medical assessments. So yes, there is an additional cost for putting on overtime at the weekends and also the services and the support that needs to keep our test centres open, but I don't think it would be a major factor in that deficit position.
Would you have to revisit looking at that overtime because of the deficit that you find yourselves in?
I think if the overtime position is one that we keep a very close eye on as we try to manage our waiting times. As we've said before, and I think it's been raised by committee members in the past, how sustainable is it keeping your test centres open on Sundays and on bank holidays, the impact that has on staff. So we would like to get back to our normal operating template, which is operating 6 days a week, Monday to Saturday, and we'll continue to monitor that process very closely in the months ahead.
Do you envisage that you would get back to that normal operating, 6 days a week? Will that include, once these new test centres are up and going, do you reckon that will hopefully help get to that normal operating model again?
Well, certainly that is the desire to get back to that normal operating time. The capacity, the infrastructure capacity that those test centres will give us will certainly help us achieve that aim. But obviously there's other elements to that in terms of the recruitment of the additional vehicle examiners, and we're about to go out for another recruitment competition for vehicle examiners. I think it's on Monday. So there are different elements that factor into how many tests we can conduct, and the people element is obviously a very significant part of that.
The last time you were up at committee, you were out for recruitment back then, or going out to recruitment. Can you tell me the success of that recruitment campaign?
Yes, I can. Through that competition, I think we brought in, and Pat can correct me if I'm wrong here, 35 vehicle examiners, and that exhausted that list. So I say we have prioritised, the department to prioritise the vehicle examiner competition to be taken forward in this quarter, and as Pat says, that'll be advertised next week.
Okay. Members, Keith?
Yeah, thanks gentlemen for coming on. A couple of quick questions. The temporary exemption certificates, if they did away with or were done away with it tomorrow, for example, will Hydebank and Mollusk, when they're operational, cover that number-wise to prevent your days slipping? You know where I'm coming from? So in other words, what you're not doing now with those, will those other two new facilities cover that?
I've not got resource.
Providing we've got the people resource, Keith.
So the facility will, but
the
bodies.
facility, the infrastructure capacity would be there, yeah.
Okay. So Mollusk, we talked about, when did you say that? Sorry, I missed that. When, roughly October?
Construction of Mollusk is due to be complete in the autumn. And
do you see the current facilities you have today operating and running? Are they manned, or if that's the right terminology, 20 as in all the time? Is all the lanes up to full capacity with people, or is people an issue now? As in staffing?
Yes, I hand over to Pat.
The test centres operate at 100% every single day, based on the resource that's in those test centres on those days. But we are recruiting for additional resource because of vacancies that exist in each of our test centres, and that's the result of retirements and people leaving to go to other jobs that are more attractive than ours. So they're running at 100% as best as we can possibly manage them.
If the staff's there.
If the staff's
but
there.
let's say sickness and stuff, what would your average percentage be? Because you're not going to be at 100% every day.
No, we're running at 100% in terms of who's there. So every vehicle examiner has a full work programme that day, and we really increased that work programme by one extra vehicle per person back in September of last year. But when we're running with sickness absence differs from test centre to test centre. Some are better than others in that regard, and you can't really predict for that. But you're probably, I think from memory, and I need to go and check it, but I think we're running at something like 8% is our sickness absence rate within our test centres. But we've got a vacancy level as well. But in addition to that, we carry extra resource in the test centre, and we refer to that, using your term there, if that's the right term, the spur man. And that spur man's there so that on the day if somebody does report in sick, we've got that spur resource to allocate to that lane so that the customer isn't impacted.
Was all the current test centres running at 100%? And forget about if the people are there or not. Is your output 100%? I appreciate if somebody doesn't turn up a vehicle, for example, but is your test centres operating at 100%?
Our test centres are operating at 100% for all the resource that is in that test centre on that day to deliver testing.
If the resource is there?
Yes.
But is it there?
In some cases, it's not because we're carrying a vacancy, but when we determine what is 100%, it's 100% on availability. So are we using our resource as best we possibly can?
I'm confused with that, and maybe it's just me. So if I was to look back the last month, for example, is the test centres operating at 100%?
Yes, okay. The resource that's there.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you.
Can just check anybody else? I just want to come back there. You're recruiting for more people at the minute, right? And I don't want to preempt anything that's going to come out of the biennial consultation because we don't know what the outcomes of that may be or may not be. But are we putting the cart before the horse here in terms of we're recruiting, but then if we go to biannual testing, the capacity there, do we really need these staff, and we may be moving to a situation where we have that biannual testing in place?
I think it's a valid question in terms of we are carrying vacancies across our network at the minute, and most of our test centres. Biennial testing, depending on the outcome of the consultation and decisions taken by the Minister going forward, I mean, it would take a considerable amount of time for a biennial testing regime to be implemented. As far as our own staff resource, we are losing staff, through natural wastage, that retire or leave to go to other jobs. So I don't think at this stage the recruitment, for example, the last competition we got 35 examiners in. If we get a similar number, we will be able to manage that resource across our network for the foreseeable future. That's not a big problem.
Can I just clarify what is the numbers in terms of your vacancies at this moment in time?
I think we have now, I need to check, in terms of our list of vacancies, of something like 28 vacancies. However, we would obviously then need to consider the position with regard to Hyde Bank and when it opens, and filling those vacancies as part of that process.
Okay. And to be in a supply position going forward as we lose other staff as a result of retirement or for other reasons. But in relation to the biennial testing, that would require a change to primary legislation, which could be 2 to 3 years. And we would need to resource the network for that period of time until such times as the primary legislation come in. But at the moment, we're working on what we know, and we know is that there isn't biennial testing, there is annual testing.
Okay, want to just lastly for myself go to Target 7, which obviously sets out DVA's performance for responding to customer complaints, and you have a target of 97% for stage 1 and 2 complaints, and the performance at end of Q3 is 99.7% and 100% respectively. How many complaints does DVA receive each year?
We publish an annual complaints report. I think from memory last year it was 872 complaints last year, and a similar amount the year before, I do believe. This year it is slightly down. And obviously the two-stage complaints process that we have, initially it's dealt with the business area, and then the stage 2 complaints are all signed off by me as the Chief Executive, and then if they're unhappy with that outcome, they can go to the Northern Ireland Public Service Ombudsman if they're unhappy with the response that they've received at the stage 2. So,
and what would be the nature of those complaints?
It could be a variety of things in terms of customers not happy with the outcome of a driving test or a vehicle test result, delays in the licensing process, attitude and behaviours of some of our examiners. There's a range, and I say that's all broken down in the annual complaints report that's published and available for the committee to view.
Okay. Stephen?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just briefly, and thanks for the presentation. And it is good news that, in terms of it is an easier experience for all of us and our constituents, ultimately to book an MOT after a few difficult years. Just around the TEC thing, I think sticking plaster is probably an unfair term, but it is more of a short-term measure, which I do believe has been positive and effective. Has it been looked at? I know it was mentioned in the consultation about the 4 years for your first test. Now an OGB is 3 years, I understand, but is there any merit in looking at maybe 5 years, given that it is a newer vehicle ultimately than some of the cars that are benefiting from a TEC? Can be a 6 or 7 year old car.
Again, it is, yes, it's a matter for the department, and there may well be some comments in that space around the consultation, and they will be pulling together the consultation responses and providing a synopsis report for the Minister's consideration, which I assume will then be shared with the committee. So, yes, there are a number of options, but I think in terms of the directive, the minimum requirement is to have the first test at 4 years. That is set. That is set down.
Do you feel? Is there any evidence to suggest, that road safety has been compromised through TECs from your experience?
There's no evidence that I'm aware of, and certainly the vehicles that we specified in terms of those TECs were carefully considered, because they are newer vehicles. Yeah. If they're properly maintained, they should not present any road safety issues.
Yeah, but it is the plan to do away with TECs then once these two centres, is that correct at the minute?
We carefully monitor the position and say, the centres will give us the infrastructure capacity to test vehicles, and then we'll have to then look at the people capacity through our recruitment competitions. But yes, they're right, they're temporary by nature, and we would hopefully remove those and get back to our normal annual testing regime until such times as there's any decisions made on the way forward around biennial testing.
No, thanks for that. And it is good news that it is easier to get, and even the experience is easier for people where your staff come and take the vehicle right from the start, rather than the midway point, which was challenging for some people that didn't enjoy the experience really. So I think that is good work as well.
Some of our customers felt they were being tested rather than the car.
Yeah, I know. Worse than going to the dentist, maybe. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, I don't have anybody else asking any other questions in relation to the business plan, so I think we'll now move into closed session. So I'll move the committee into closed session. Thank you.
Committee Room 29. Sound. Committee Room 29. Sound.